Hey, what's going on everybody? It's etaprime back here again. Today we've got kind of a special video, and this is something I've been super excited about for a little while now. So if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you know I love my small form factor AMD APU builds, and I've been searching for a small form factor case that was kind of, perfect for my needs and a lot of other people's needs out there. I found a few on Amazon, eBay, and AliExpress, but nothing really met the needs that I was really looking for, so I actually decided to reach out and see if we could get one built. And it happened. So in 2021, I reached out to my good buddy over at KKSB Cases. They're really known for their awesome metal single board computer cases, but about 2 years ago, they did create a mini ITX gaming case that supported a full-size GPU. But I'm not looking for a case that'll support a GPU. It takes up more room than I need for an APU build. And we have RDNA2 and RDNA3 Desktop APUs right around the corner. They are going to be putting out some awesome gaming performance, but if Ryzen 7000 is any indication on how much power and heat these things are going to generate, then we needed a case that would support a larger cooler. I also wanted reliable power delivery. I didn't want to have to rely on a Pico power supply, and obviously we can build much smaller with one of those. But a lot of them that are on Amazon aren't that reliable, plus we have to use a power brick when it comes to those Pico power supplies. So I figured, an SFX power supply would deliver more than enough for an APU, and they're relatively cheap now. You can pick up a 400 watt for about $35, which will suffice for an APU. And that's the kind of case I'm looking for when it comes to these APU builds. So I started up Photoshop and came up with kind of a little rough sketch here, and I sent it over to my buddy at KKSB Cases. This is the exact thing that I sent over to him. Mini ITX, no GPU slots, SFX power supply, good cooler support, basically an AMD APU case. I was hoping that this could kind of be done just in time for the Ryzen 5700G and the 5600G, but with everything going on in the world, it was a bit late. But recently, I got a package in the mail, and here it is. This thing is exactly what I was looking for. Small form factor, mini ITX, SFX power supply. It also supports a 120mm AIO, or if you want to go with air, you can do up to a 130mm tall air cooler inside of this unit. No GPU support to keep it as small as possible, and remember, these little APUs can pull some power. Even the 5700G with an overclock on the CPU and the GPU can pull up to around 160 watts that I've seen in some of my tests. So they can get quite hot. And like I mentioned, if Ryzen 7000 is any indication of the newer APUs that are going to be released, they're going to pull even more power and get hotter. That's just the way it is right now with these CPUs on the market. They're trying to throw as much power at them to get as much performance out of them as they can, because we're not working with ARM chips here. This is x86. And even though this is kind of the first one off of the line, doing some prototype testing here, we've got the accessories that go with the case, 2 USB 3.0 ports up front, we've got our power button, and all of the screws we need to get everything assembled here. Since I don't have access to a good RDNA2 APU or even RDNA3, we're going to go with a good Vega chip. This is one of my favorites still right now until we get some good desktop APUs. The Ryzen 7 5700G, and it's been a little while since I've done a video with this chip. There have been driver optimizations, and I'll tell you, I'm getting way better performance in a lot of the games I used to test with these newer drivers here on the 5700G. I definitely want to do a test build in this case, so for the motherboard, we're going with the ROG Strix B550 Gaming Mini ITX, 16GB of Aorus DDR4 running at 4400 MHz. I also went with an Aorus NVMe SSD. To keep it all cool, I chose the EnerMax LiquiMax 3 120mm AIO. I recently used their 360mm AIO on the new Intel 13th Gen i9, and it does a great job, so I figured the 120 would definitely handle this APU. And to put power to everything, I chose this inexpensive APEVA SFX 500 watt power supply. Definitely overkill, but at $35, I really couldn't pass it up. So let's go ahead and get this thing opened up. Now it does use hex hardware. I've got a 2mm hex drive here, so all the way around it, at least on the outside, it's using hex. They're actually pretty high quality and anodized. And by the way, the case is made of high-grade aluminum. Now the brackets inside are steel, but the midsection and the side panels are aluminum. And we're actually on the back side of the case right now. But we've got kind of a bracket in here that can be pulled out. And if you opt to use an AIO, this is where it's going to mount along with the motherboard. So I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about here. So backside, once again, we'll move around to the other side. And as you can see right there at the front, we've got a spot for that 120mm AIO. The fan is actually going to go in the separate compartment on the front of the case itself to draw cool air in. and this bracket is removable. So to build this, I actually just removed the bracket. I went ahead and mounted my motherboard and my AIO to this here, and just slid it right back inside of the case. You don't have to use a liquid cooler if you don't want to. This will support up to a 130mm tall air cooler, so you can put a pretty large cooler in here given that we're working with an APU. But it went together really nicely. As you can see, this board is going to mount right here to the bracket, and once you get the cooler situated, it looks something like this. This Intermax cooler worked out really well for this little build here. And I did opt to use a different fan up front with some RGB. That way the light would kind of peek out those intake vents up front. And as you can see, it's kind of got its separate section here to pull that air in from both sides. It'll run right across that AIO, and you could mount a fan in here if you wanted to, but I'm actually just relying on the PSU fan to pull all that air out. But the whole thing went together really nicely, and that Intermax 120mm AIO fits in this case perfectly. I had another option of a Corsair 120, but I went with this one, and I probably would go with this again. And like I mentioned, I did swap out that front fan just because this has the RGB right on the side here. I think it looks pretty decent. It's not going to be overkill once the side panel's on, but it will peek out a bit and give you just a little bit of color. And the RGB on this fan is fully controllable from the operating system. But I gotta say, really do love the look and form factor of this case. It's very minimalistic. Some people might not be into this, but I really like the way this thing is set up right now. The performance of the Ryzen 7 5700G is well documented. I've done a bunch of videos testing it out at different clocks with different RAM and things like that. Right now we've got that 4400 MHz RAM, and I did do a little bit of an overclock on the GPU, but I left the CPU alone, along with the pump and the fan curve. I didn't change anything from the BIOS for those. I kind of wanted to see if I really needed to ramp this up a little bit. But even running something like Spider-Man Remastered, 720p, low settings, not bad. 5700G isn't a super powerhouse, but when it comes to desktop APUs, it's really the best you can get right now. And it actually runs this game quite well. You'll see a little bit of screen tearing here, and that's because I have VSync off. I usually just lock it at 60, and it does a decent job. It'll dip every once in a while under 60, but it's actually really playable, and especially given that we're just using integrated graphics here. But one that always works really well on the 5700G is one of my favorite games anyway, Forza Horizon 5. We've got a low-medium mix here, 1080p, with resolution scale set to quality. So we do have a little downscale on the resolution, but in my opinion, it still looks great, and this is one of those games that plays amazingly on these APUs. And to tell you the truth, I actually haven't tested this game out in a little while on the 5700G, but with all of the Radeon driver updates and optimizations to the game, we could probably just set this at medium 1080p with no scale and have a good time with it. One of my favorite use case scenarios for these little APU builds is emulation, and this little chip does a great job. Here's PS3, Skate 3, and if you take a look at Afterburner, with this here we're pulling around 70 watts, but this isn't overclocked. If I put a nice little overclock on the CPU and a little more on the GPU, we can pull around 130 watts with the 5700G. And with some of the smaller form factor cases and those low profile coolers, it thermal throttles very quickly. And I'm sure with RDNA2 or RDNA3 desktop APUs, they're going to be pulling more power, and in turn they'll create more heat. And that's really why I wanted a small form factor case that would support a larger cooler. I do want to mention that I didn't specifically design this case here. I gave them my idea. This is what they came back with. And personally, I think they did an amazing job. We've got a really nice small form factor case with lots of cooling support for these APUs, plenty of power with an SFX power supply, and since they've already put the R&D into it, they're going to be selling these on their website. Actually, right now you can pre-order it, and it looks like it's right under 79 euros, so I guess around 77 or 78 USD. And one thing I didn't mention, because I personally don't use them much anymore, but this does have enough space for 4 2.5-inch SSDs. But this is a case I'll definitely be using in the future for a lot of my little APU builds, especially once AMD starts rolling out those more higher-end APUs. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. Really appreciate you watching. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments below. Is this something you would consider using for an APU build, or would you just go with a larger case so you do have GPU support later on down the road? I'd actually like to know your thoughts, and if you've got any questions, let me know in the comments below. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, and like always, thanks for watching.